So welcome back. Today we're going to talk about cost classifications. There are different ways in which we can think of and categorize costs, and this is basically a review from the management information paper. But of course we would expect now the candidates to have a deeper and more profound grasp of costs and the reason why costs are measured according to different criteria. The first distinction is production versus non-production costs. Production costs are, of course, important to know what it costs to get to complete and put a unit product into inventory. And it just allows us to be able to focus on different parts of the organization to isolate and examine costs with a view to being able to control them and budget them. Let's move on to the distinction between direct and indirect costs. By now, this should be thoroughly familiar. The idea that direct costs are directly attributable to a product and therefore quite easily assigned, whereas indirect costs are much trickier. These are also referred to as overhead costs. There is no direct relationship between an overhead cost and units of product, and therefore we need to spend a bit more time, at least management accountants, cost management accountants, spend a lot of time, in fact, trying to determine and quantify the behavior of overhead costs. Then fans of the marginal costing system will be happy to see the distinction between fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs, clearly costs that remain constant regardless of the volume of production, and variable costs vary in proportion with the volume produced. Now these are pure types of costs. We know that in reality it's unusual that a fixed cost really remains fixed. It doesn't stay permanently static. Perhaps at a contractual level, a fixed cost does stay the same if we think of rent, for example, because there the amount is specified, or for telephone subscription, there are things which are fixed. There are other costs, however, which may in fact have a fixed element and a variable element to them, and therefore constitute mixed costs. And we would need to be able to separate out and isolate the fixed from the variable element in such costs. And then, of course, we will have seen many examples of different kinds of costs in action, and perhaps from own experience the candidate will have observed that in fact some costs remain kind of fixed in the short run, but in the long run they tend to be variable in the sense that they somehow do either go up over time or they go up in a big leap and then they stay fixed for certain under certain conditions. We could imagine, for example, a cement plant. It will have a certain amount of capacity with certain fixed costs up to a point, but then when if we add capacity to the factory, then we're increasing the fixed costs in steps to reflect the fact that we are actually changing the profile and the cost structure of the factory by adding more capacity. Let's look at a quantitative technique here called the high-low method to be able to separate out the fixed and variable elements of a mixed cost, the fixed and the variable elements. Here we have, for example, output and costs that go up. Now the question is whether the output goes up strictly proportionally to the output. If we start with an output of 1,000 units, for example, corresponding to $250,000 in costs, we can see that the costs, while they go up, may not go up in exact proportion to the rise in output. But what we can do is we can say, okay, as output goes up, the costs go up generally, and we can define a line which would connect the first observation here, 1,000 units of output being associated with $250,000 in costs, and if we go up to 1,600 output, this being associated with a cost level of 370,000. Now let's just see if we can quantify this relationship in a slightly more rigorous way. One can see here that for an increase of 600 units increase, the costs go up by 370,000 minus 250,000. That difference is 120,000. So if we find this ratio, 120,000, which is the rise in costs, against a 600 unit increase in output, what we're saying is the result 200 represents the dollar variable cost per unit for these four observations. In fact, we have determined the variable cost per unit, this $200. Now let's just think in terms of a formula. The total costs that we see here, total costs, will be equal to fixed costs plus variable costs. And what we do know at the moment is that at an output level of 1,000 units, we have total costs of $250,000. We also know that the variable costs associated with an output of 1,000 units will be equal to 1,000 units times $200 per unit. That was the variable cost per unit. Therefore, $250,000 will be equal to the fixed cost, which we don't know at the moment, plus 1,000 times $200, which is equal to $200,000. 200,000 from 250,000 implies that the fixed costs are equal to, that's it, $50,000. For the skeptical minded, I invite you to double check this answer for the output level of 1,600 units. Calculate the fixed costs and the variable costs at an output level of 1,600 units. No surprise there. Fixed costs are 50,000. Variable costs will be 1,600 units times the variable cost per unit. That doesn't change. The answer will be $370,000. All we've done is shown that the formula we used is consistent with a straight line drawn between the two output levels that have been identified. Now the high-low method, this is what we call the high-low method, this determination of the variable costs and the fixed costs, and can be applied to a number of situations. For example, when fixed costs would change in a step fashion along the output range, or even when the variable cost per unit changes. So there is a flexibility in terms of the application of the high-low method. Such examples or illustrations can be obtained in the context of classroom discussions.